You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Following the Hamas attack on Israel, President Joe Biden warned against an Israeli ground offensive and a wider occupation of Gaza. Starting October 27th, Israel launched a ground incursion into the Gaza Strip to purportedly fight Hamas militants and rescue hostages. Israel's military is prepared for a long campaign that's inciting new tensions in the Middle East. Before the attack, Saudi Arabia and Israel were seeking to broker a deal to normalize their relationship. And this was just one of Mohammed bin Salman's recent acts of diplomacy. During the spring, Saudi Arabia and Houthis in Yemen resumed talks on a ceasefire and truce, though it's important to note the fighting in Yemen hasn't stopped. And China helped mediate a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. A day before Israel began its ground offensive in Gaza, bin Salman was hosting an annual investment forum in Saudi's capital city of Riyadh. The Crown Prince was hearing pitches about how to remake the kingdom. But in the wake of a new war in the region, it won't be business as usual for MBS. Are the recent peace talks with Israel dead? And is bin Salman a legitimate power broker? To answer these questions, I'm joined by NPR's Aya Batrawy. She leads the network's Gulf Bureau from Dubai. Her coverage has centered on the rise of Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince and his attempts to transform the kingdom and centralize power. Aya Batrawy, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Hi, thanks for having me.
A recent article in the Wall Street Journal called the talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia the road to regional peace. With the Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's retaliation, are those talks pretty much over? Is an agreement between the two still possible?
It's definitely still possible because none of what we're seeing is frankly new. There have been 75 years of some form of this happening. Of course, the intensity and the scale is unprecedented, both in the number of casualties, injuries, and the level of destruction in Gaza, and of course, the number of deaths in Israel that were committed by militants from the Gaza Strip. But the expansion of settlements, the question of Palestine, the question of Palestinian self-determination, of whether there can be two states, none of that has been resolved and none of that is new. And these talks were happening not just in serious fashion, and that's according to Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince in an interview he gave Fox News just a few weeks before all of this broke out. He said the talks were very serious with the Biden administration for there to be normalization with Israel. But it was happening with the most right-wing government in Israel's history, despite repeated statements from countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others that were warning of these constant escalations in the West Bank, the incursions in refugee camps like Jenin in the West Bank, saying that the situation is untenable and very dangerous. And of course, we saw a lot of tensions around the holy sites of Al-Aqsa, which is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in the months leading up to this, mass arrests, mass casualties in the West Bank. So none of that is new, and the talks were going on. And the reason for that is because Saudi Arabia was going to get a lot out of Washington if Washington was willing to agree to it. And that was going to be security deals, potentially nuclear technology transfer, a security pact, and much more.
So the agreement is still possible. Has the current conflict in Gaza upped the ante for any future agreement, pulled a more comprehensive settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian tension really into the frame in a way that it wouldn't have been absent the Hamas attack?
I would take it even a step further and say that what this situation, this war that we're seeing on the ground did was it really drew a huge question mark over the idea that these are peace accords and that these would somehow bring peace to the region. And I think what the Palestinian attacks in Israel showed was that in the absence of a peace process, in the absence of a two-state solution, in the absence of an answer to what to do with millions of Palestinian refugees and millions of Palestinians under occupation, can this region truly economically prosper and can there be peace? Can you go around the Palestinians? And of course, the Saudis were trying to see if they could get something for the Palestinians in a deal with Israel so that they don't face like political backlash and regional backlash for completely, let's say, abandoning the Palestinians, as the UAE was blamed for doing when they had brokered their normalization deal with Israel. They were literally told by the Palestinians that they were backstabbers. So Saudi Arabia wanted to avoid that, particularly because of its religious clout being the birthplace of Islam. But again, I'll just go back to these talks are on ice, but they are not over. And the Saudi Crown Prince very much, I believe, would like to see these talks continue at some point, but they cannot happen now. Absolutely not.
Mohammed bin Salman has made it clear he doesn't want to see a ground invasion from Israel in Gaza. And senior officials in the Biden administration have said pretty much the same thing. And everyone seems to fear that a wide open, full-on invasion could be the start of a more dangerous, more comprehensive war in the region. We're now still in the early stages of the Israeli incursion into Gaza. What does it look to you like Israel's trying to do?
Well, I would just say the U.S. has not cautioned at all. If anything, they've said there are no red lines for Israel. That's what we heard John Kirby say the other day. There are no red lines. And the U.S. has made clear they do not. The Biden administration does not believe in a ceasefire. And I have also heard from reporters in Washington that are in constant touch with Biden administration officials. We've also read that there are some Arab leaders that are publicly saying one thing and privately saying something else. And what they're privately saying is crush Hamas. Now, which Arab leaders are saying that is a question mark. But there is this sort of doing one thing and saying something else. And I think that that's happening in the region. But the Arab sentiment, the public sentiment, is horrified by the images coming out of Gaza. At the time that we're rolling here, there are over 3,300 children killed, over 8,000 people. 70% of those are women and children in the Gaza Strip. And those are very horrifying images for people because these are Palestinians. They speak Arabic. They have names like the names of the children in this region. They look the same. And again, like I said, the question of Palestinian statehood and determination continues to be something that's regionally important to a lot of people in the Middle East. They see that that has to be resolved. But on a ground invasion level, I think that Israel doesn't have a plan. And I think we've heard that time and again, that they just don't have a plan for exactly how they're going to carry this out and how they're going to get rid of Hamas, how they're going to uproot it, how they're going to dislodge it from the Gaza Strip, and how they're going to run the Gaza Strip, or what to do with 2.3 million Palestinians if that is achieved. And again, what's the cost going to be politically with civilian deaths and so much more. And the regional cost, of course, with Iran in the background constantly threatening, this could be very bad for the rest of the region.
Have the events of the last several weeks really brought into much sharper focus the gap between the leaders of countries in the region and the people of the countries in the region? Have leaders had to quickly shift in order to get more in line with what's going on among their populations?
Yes, there have been multiple instances of walking back, essentially, policies. Let's start with Egypt. At the very beginning of this conflict, on October 7th, the directives from Egypt's presidency to state-aligned media outlets in Egypt to mosques and sermons was tone it down. We really don't want to inflame the public sentiment. And once there started to be evidence presented to Egypt and leaks that Israel had plans and Israel was lobbying to push Palestinians into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, Egypt's president had to come out and essentially call for street protests in support of the Palestinian cause and saying that they would never abandon the Palestinian cause. So you have that, for example, happening in Egypt, a real shift in the rhetoric from the top down. You also have situations like in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates has been open arms with Israel since they signed a normalization pact in 2020 under President Trump. And now they're having all these donation drives for Palestinian Red Crescent and canceling major concerts and other kinds of festivities, again, to kind of keep their pulse on the sentiment, not just among their citizens, but among millions of foreign nationals that live here, including Palestinians and people from across the Middle East.
I'm wondering whether this conflict comes in the process of Saudi Arabia trying to do something new regionally, reassert itself as the key player, let's say, the key nation. Obviously, as the custodians of the two holy places, as a country that has spread a lot of money around historically to extend its influence. Saudi Arabia has never really disappeared. But I wonder whether under MBS there was something else going on that, for better or worse, has had to be put on hold right now.
Yeah, and we're seeing it across the Gulf. We're seeing it also in Abu Dhabi. We're seeing it in Doha in Qatar, and we're seeing it, of course, in Riyadh with the Saudi Crown Prince. And that is a new leadership, a young new leadership, a new generation of leadership that is really trying to reorient the public discourse in their countries from one of pan-Islamism, pan-Arabism, to one of national identity, strictly within its borders. And so this idea that we're somehow all connected as Arabs or all connected as Muslims in one big community, it's really sort of dwindling down into like a very nationalistic, hyper-nationalistic kind of dialogue. And we're seeing that, of course, in Europe as well, this kind of isolationist attitude towards the rest of the world. We've seen it also in the US. So it's not something unusual to the Gulf, but for the Gulf, it's kind of a new take on things. And then, of course, this new bold sort of assertive leadership that says we have to hedge our alliances. So if that means we have to continue in an oil pact with Russia, and that helps its economy, but it also helps ours, well, we're going to do that, despite pleas from Washington to pump, let's say, more barrels of oil. If it means that we're going to continue to have relationships with Iran and Israel, that's what they're going to do, and that's what we've seen them do time and again. If it means having relationships with China and Washington at the same time, that's what they're doing. All of that said, though, all of these Arab Gulf nations, Washington is their number one security partner, their most important security partner. And in all of these countries, the second language taught is English. So American culture, American defense, American universities, they still reign supreme in this part of the world. And they're still seen as like the number one to go to for help, for assistance, for anything is the United States. And so that security partnership hasn't changed.
But you do mention the wild card for understanding all of this, and that's Iran. Iran's role in the planning and execution of the Hamas attack on Israeli territory is not yet fully defined, but Iran was said to be in the process of ratcheting down its conflicts with Saudi Arabia. Is that process in the deep freeze now?
No, like we saw Iranian officials meeting with a number of Gulf officials, lower level, but again, those talks are still happening. I think part of what we saw, this reset we saw in the region with, for example, outreach to Syria after years of trying to topple the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad there was outreach to him, whether that was also outreach to Israel, whether that's been outreach to Turkey, outreach to Qatar, all these countries that Saudi Arabia was at odds with, had friction with, or was outright regional enemies with. We're now seeing a reset in that diplomacy. That hasn't changed. If anything, conversations with Iranian officials have probably gone into a diplomatic flurry in the past few weeks because really these Gulf countries do not want to see the Persian Gulf oil shipments, their own security, their borders threatened by what's happening in Gaza.
You've spent a lot of time reporting from that part of the world. What has the effect been on the other regional actors in the last several weeks? Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, at a time when that country was ready to flex its muscles under a recently re-elected Erdogan.
Again, I really think that we can go back to the core, which is all that was happening wasn't actually resolving the core issues of what to do about Palestinians. What do you do with millions of Palestinian refugees? What is the plan for the West Bank? What is the plan for a two-state solution? Is that even possible? What is the plan under the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu that was expanding settlements, that was expanding house expulsions and house demolitions of Palestinians? All of that had never been resolved. And so what we saw October 7th was, unfortunately, a lot of civilians killed in Israel, a lot of families shocked and torn apart. And then, of course, that happening in Gaza Strip with 8,000 plus civilians or people killed, and many of them, 70% of them, again, women and children. And I think that has just really thrown a lot of the sort of status quo of things in the air and sort of ripped up the cards, the deck of cards. You know, I've been reading Israeli articles. I've been reading in the Wall Street Journal articles that said that For a long time under Benjamin Netanyahu, there had been a policy of almost sort of tolerating Hamas in order not to have to deal with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and then have to really engage in a proper peace process. That's changed. Now the plan is we have to get rid of Hamas. And then what? Bring in the Palestinian Authority on the back of an Israeli tank into Gaza? How is that going to work? So I think what this ended up doing, this conflict, this horrific, brutal war that we're seeing, it's really just upended a lot of the status quo that had been in place. And the question is, do we go back to that status quo after this settles, the dust settles? Does the dust settle? How long does this take? What is the cost to the region? What is the cost to America and American forces and America's reputation in the world, America's military might as well? So many questions now really posed at this moment.
Does this have the potential, the possibility to create a kind of cold peace? During the latter stages of the Trump administration, there were the much ballyhooed agreements between Israel and various Gulf and Arabian Peninsula nations. Israel's been technically at peace with Egypt for decades, but so what? I mean, the countries are hardly chummy. Does this have the potential to really dampen the future possibilities of those Abraham Accord agreements?
Well, I would say in the Gulf, it was a warm peace. I mean, it was an open embrace of Israelis to the UAE, to Bahrain. A lot of deals were signed. A lot of trade was going on. It wasn't a cold peace in the Gulf with the countries that signed those peace accords. I would say, yes, it's been a cold peace for decades with Egypt and maybe Jordan in some respects. But I think here it wasn't like that. But now, again, how do you re-engage in that same capacity at that same level? I think a lot of it will depend also on the Israeli government and what that looks like. Does Netanyahu have to step down at some point? Does a more leftist or more coalition-like government come in its place? I mean, there's still a lot of questions, I think, about what happens internally in the political landscape of Israel that might answer that question sort of as to what the relationship with Israel's neighbors will look like.
Let's switch to more long-term questions. Mohammed bin Salman is a young guy. I mean, certainly relative to some of the leaders he talks to, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden, Recep Tayyip Erdogan are pretty old, and he is going to be around maybe for decades to come. He has great ambitions for his country. How should Americans understand what he wants to achieve for Saudi Arabia? What does the country and its role in the world look like in 2040, in 2050?
A lot of that will depend, of course, if he does take over the throne, as is expected when his father, King Salman, eventually does pass. He's in his 80s and the Crown Prince is in his late 30s. But what we've seen from the Crown Prince so far is a laser focus on numbers, statistics. And he's brought in a whole range of Western consultancies and consultants to crunch those numbers for him. And so he has this Vision 2030 and these plans to have, unemployment at a certain level, tourism up, to diversify the economy away from just reliance on oil exports, because again, the future hopefully will be green and hopefully the planet will be around for that to happen. So he's really trying to move away from reliance on just oil exports for the economy to power the economy. And so he's building these huge resorts in the Red Sea that are going to rival the Maldives. He's trying to build these huge entertainment districts in Riyadh. He's changed a lot of the laws and loosened a lot of these social restraints, movie theaters, concerts, women can mix with men in public. All these things have radically changed sort of the appearance of Saudi Arabia and life for a lot of people in Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, to do that, he's also essentially taken all abilities for anyone to push for that change away. So under King Abdullah before him, there had been a space, relatively modest, but a space for women to protest, let's say, for the right to drive or to get rid of male guardianship laws that were stifling their ability to travel abroad or do anything without male permission. There had been a space for human rights lawyers in Saudi Arabia. There had been a space for writers and poets, even if it was very small. That's completely been extinguished. A lot of these people have been imprisoned, they're on travel bans. We've seen death sentences and life sentences for people who've retweeted stuff that's critical of the Crown Prince. Obviously, there was the killing of Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi people that work for the Crown Prince in Turkey in 2018. So to achieve what he wants to achieve, there's been also this complete clampdown on the social space. So just because we've seen social reforms doesn't mean we're seeing an opening in Saudi Arabia necessarily. And so when I go to Saudi Arabia and I go there these days, as opposed to when I used to go there under the King Abdullah, I find it very difficult to gauge how people really feel. It's hard to gauge their temperature because I don't know if when I ask them how they feel about something, if they're telling me what they think they should say or if they're telling me how they truly feel. And that wasn't really always the case before. I can't even meet with some of the sources and people that I used to meet with before because it would be a danger to them that you can actually go to jail for talking to journalists. That has been in the charge sheet of some women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia, talking to journalists. So it comes at a cost. And I think that we've seen the United States as a policy embrace those social reforms, sometimes turn a blind eye, sometimes to these human rights crackdown that we've seen, and other times call it out. But, the fact that there was these serious negotiations for a security pact and all of that to normalize with Israel, I think, for a lot of Saudi activists that have paid a very heavy price for trying to advocate for real reform, they see that as something that was very disheartening.
Is there a point at which these ambitions, some of which you've just described, kind of run smack into reality or structural constraints that just are hard to get around? I mean, Saudi Arabia is a huge country with a very small population, where a lot of the work day in and day out is done by migrants and resident aliens. The constraints on the amount of water, the amount of arable land really limit just how much leeway there is to turn the place into a tourist destination, to make it a place where lots of people want to live. This move toward diversifying the economy, well, is there anything that Saudi Arabia can do that the rest of the world wants to buy, that can become a future source of income without a reliance on oil? A lot of these ambitions seem very notable, very admirable, but I wonder, if the country has to import alfalfa from Arizona, is it realistic to think it can become like France?
I don't think they want to become like France. I think that they see Europe as an aging region. They see it as creaky. Riyadh, in many ways, looks to Dubai as a model to follow, not Europe, and certainly not the U.S. So Dubai is majority population in the UAE. It's only 1.3 million locals, and then the rest of the population, around 9 million, are foreigners. But to keep that in place, you have to have security. And that's why any threat to airports, to the coasts, to schools, to living could really bring that whole deck of cards down. Because people don't have buy-in. They're not citizens. They don't belong here. They just own property for a period of time, maybe long-term visas, and that's it. So I think Saudi Arabia looks to the UAE sometimes as a model. There's competition between Riyadh and Dubai for businesses. But look, here's what I would say to that. If you look at what happened this month in October, during the midst of this Gaza war, there was the Davos in the Desert forum that the Crown Prince holds every year. It's called the Future Investment Initiative. And if you look at who was there, you'll see it's some of the world's most powerful men. Had the CEO of BlackRock, for example, all of these major hedge funds that control a lot of our economy around the world were there. And they all see that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf is where the money is. Look at these sovereign wealth funds. We're talking a lot of money here, and they're looking for ways to invest it. And so there's a lot of people coming here seeing that Saudi Arabia, especially, is just booming with projects, and they see that there's a lot of money to be made. And so, will he run up against some of these realistic obstacles of people maybe not wanting to choose Saudi Arabia as a tourist destination? Sure, it'll take time. But he's got all the time in the world. Like I said, he's only in his late 30s. And already he's managed to help Saudis stay in Saudi Arabia and spend their money in Saudi instead of always traveling to Dubai or Bahrain for tourism. So there's domestic money being spent. There's also money being spent on healthcare, on improving the education system, on new housing, new roads, new bridges, everything you can imagine, new stadiums to keep people placated and satisfied in Saudi Arabia. And his target is the Saudi population. That's his main target, making sure that there are enough jobs because he's inheriting a population that is very young. 70% of the population is under 35 years old. And so a lot of these young people are coming of age. They're going to need jobs. They're going to need incomes. They're going to need housing. And the public sector, the government, cannot employ everybody. And so he's got to create this private sector. And to do that, he's sort of just top down creating all these small businesses and creating all these government entities with oil money. in the hopes of diversifying the economy. And that's really the race against time that he's up against, and that's why you see them moving so fast.
NPR's Aya Batrawy joins us from Dubai. Thanks a lot for being our guest on Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Adam Ailey and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Young is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.